Hello and welcome to Friends with Deficits. I'm your host, Adam Sultan. I have a little bit of a disclaimer before we get started. Not all of my guests are people I've actually been long friends with. In fact, some of them I haven't even met. I'd sure like to, though. Perhaps with your support, I can travel and shake hands with all the cool and brave folks I've got the chance to talk with. And you can help by visiting patreon.com/friendswithdeficits. See what I did there? Anyway, my next friend is Frankie. And before we hear her story, I have another disclaimer. This one's a little serious. Part of our conversation deals with suicide. So I just thought I'd give you a heads up. All right, and now without any further ado, let's meet Frankie.
Hi, I'm Frankie. It's very nice to finally talk to you.
Yeah, so you go by Frankie?
Yeah, I go by Frankie.
With two E's, I see. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
My Instagram is Flower Frankiee.
Okay. And where are you at?
I live in California, in my boyfriend's van.
Okay. What part of California are you? I guess if you're in a van, you're up and all over the place, no?
Yeah, we travel all around.
Are you from California?
No, I'm actually from right outside of Philadelphia. I grew up in Pennsylvania, a few hours outside of Philadelphia, and it was me and both of my parents, a mom and a dad. And I have a sister who's 10 years older than me, who moved out of the house when I was 6 years old. My parents were very dysfunctional people. They both had a great love for prescription medication. And this
Did,
goes way back before everything was computerized. So they had like many, many different scripts that they would rotate through.
did it start with actual, pain, the need for pain medication, or did they just take it as recreation the whole time?
From my understanding, my dad had tuberculosis when he was about 19 and then had to have spinal surgery. And I think after that just got really hooked on opioids. So my parents kind of went through different opioids. I remember as a kid them having like large like lock boxes and stuff that I later on would have been in charge of and would like dole them out their pills each day because they would steal from each other, and that would be a very large argument.
You were in charge of that?
I was, yeah.
How old were you?
I started being in charge of the lockbox when I was about 9.
Wow. Okay.
So like my dad would have a script for like Oxycontin and my mom would have a script for Dilaudid, and they would often trade them. And then in order to deter my dad from taking my mom's pills, I would hide my mom's, and then I would be in charge of the trading of who would get what and how much they would trade it for.
Did you know at the time, that they were taking drugs? Did you think of it as medicine, or were you?
I definitely thought of it as medicine until I got into high school. And I mean, of course, they were a prescription. And what I later realized was that because everything wasn't computerized, and it was all like all of your medical paperwork would just be like papers that would be filed by a receptionist at the doctor's office. So my parents both had several different pain management doctors that would give them different scripts. And then they both have several different psychiatrists. So they had scripts going from Ambien to Xanax to Klonopin, and then they would be mixing like Ambien with Percocet and Dilaudid. And then my mom also had a really bad problem with Benadryl, which is on DXM, like a lot of people do, like NyQuil or cough syrup. So she would take the DXM and crush it up, and then that also makes you hallucinate. So combining that with the Ambien, my mom would have these very vivid hallucinations.
What's DXM?
I forget what it actually stands for, but it's a compound in like NyQuil and different sort of sleeping pills, where it makes you like hallucinate. It's
Mm.
kind of like people who can't get their hands on acid and don't really know what a good trip is like.
Right. Did you know she was having these hallucinations? Was she talking about them or just acting strange?
Yeah, I would know she would have hallucinations. She would say things that didn't make sense, and she would act out very badly. And she was also like very abusive to everyone in the house, physically, verbally. she would do a lot of things and then forget that she had done them, or she would see things in the house that clearly weren't there. Like I remember one time she like came in into the living room and was like very concerned that there was a tree growing in the middle of the living room and that kids were climbing too high on the tree and they were going to fall and get hurt. And she was trying to get me to get them down. And I was like trying to get her to go to bed because there's no
Wow.
tree in our living room.
Wow. Who else was in the household at that time?
It was mostly just the three of us. My sister moved out when I was
Mm.
6.
Did she move out for any particular reason related to that, or?
She moved out because we left the town of her high school her senior year, and she wanted to graduate with her friends. But I think a lot of it was also probably that my mom was very abusive towards her, and our household was just a difficult one to be in.
Are you guys still in touch, you and your sister?
We are not. After my parents committed suicide, she had legal guardianship of me for about 2 years, and it unfortunately tore us apart and did not bring us closer. Um, I think it was a combination of I was 15 when my parents died, so she was 25.
Hmm.
And it was a very traumatic event. She had never been a mom or mother figure before. Her and I had never been close because she had moved out when I was so young. And I wasn't just a child who needed a guardian. I was older, I was a teenager. Teenagers are brats. I was recently orphaned, but especially being orphaned to something like suicide has a lot different of a reaction on a teenage mind when you don't really understand things like that. And I wasn't willing to take any structure or like parenting from her. So I was very rebellious and we argued a lot.
So what happened to your parents?
So there were a few instances when I was a kid where my parents would talk a lot about suicide and would tell me that they were very depressed and that they hated being alive. And I remember there was one time I played field hockey for my high school, and my dad very often would leave the house. And this one time, my freshman year of high school, he left the house with apparently like a bag of guns and a bunch of pills. And he told my mom that he was never coming back. And I'm on the bus on the way to a field hockey game, and I get these texts from my mom that my dad is going to kill himself. And I start crying on the bus, and my coach has to like pull me aside and tell me that I need to like get it together, and that like I couldn't be acting like that in a public setting. And so I kind of like shut myself down and I made it through the game. And my dad came home the next day and my coach emailed my mom and said that like if I wanted to stay on the team, I had to enroll in therapy. My mom kept me home for 3 days, never enrolled me in therapy, wrote a fake letter for my coach that she had, and then sent me back to school. And nobody ever talked about it again. And it was probably about 8 months after that that I'm at school again. We were taking like standardized state testing, so we got out of school early at 12. And my mom picks me up from the high school and she tells me that my dad left again and he's going to go kill himself and we're better off without him and we should just let him go. And I got really upset with her and I asked her how long ago did he tell her these things. And it had been a few hours, and I tried contacting him, and his phone is off. And so I called the police, and eventually they're able to like pinpoint the location of his phone. After some time, he puts his phone back on to start like saying goodbye to people, and they find the location of the hotel that he's staying at. And as soon as they get there to knock on the door and pull him out of the hotel room, he shot himself in the head. And that was May 13th, 2014, when I was 15 and I was a freshman in high school.
Man, that's heavy, needless to say. Um, did you said your dad was calling people to say goodbyes? Did he call
Yeah.
you or contact you?
So I was calling my dad over and over again, and I was the one in contact with the police, and he was texting me a little bit. And I kept asking him to please call me. And my mom was freaking out and really, really high that day. And she kept saying just like really inappropriate things that like I should just let my dad kill himself. I don't remember exactly what happened, but she had gone into the other room and was like making a scene, and I had to go calm her down. And in the maybe like 5 or 10 minutes that I had stepped away from my phone the first time that day to deal with my mom was when my dad had called me. And when I got back and saw that I missed the call, I kept texting him and saying that I was so sorry that I had left my phone in the room and to please call me back, and he never did. The month after that was very difficult. My sister and her now husband lived with us, and I worked with my mother, and she was abusing drugs very badly and was in a very, very bad state. And then June 22nd, she overdosed in the house and took her own life. Um, and my sister found her in the morning, and I woke up to my sister screaming. And I go upstairs, and my mom was lying on the floor, and my sister's now husband was giving my mom um, like mouth to mouth, and she was calling the ambulance.
Sorry, I don't really have an
Oh,
appropriate response, I guess.
it's
Other than
okay.
sorry. Yeah. What happened after that?
I would say the first year I was very numb and I kept playing field hockey. So my summer pretty much consisted of that. And I went back to school. I was in some honors classes. I was in 10th grade at this time, and I kept my grades up for a little while. So my sister had guardianship of me, and I was living in the house where my mom had killed herself. And I was living with my sister and her partner. It was very difficult to be back in a high school setting. Went to a really large high school. There were about 1,000 kids per class. And I would say that everyone that I knew, everyone in my grade had known, not just that my parents died over the summer, but how they had done it. Um, I was really lucky to have a supportive field hockey team, and a lot of my teammates did show up to the funeral and stuff. But it was hard to be in high school. I mean, high school itself is a really tough environment, but to be a sophomore and have all of that on you was a lot, and I didn't handle it very well. I started self-harming in secret, and I did that for a few months.
What do you mean self-harming?
I think at that time I was mostly just cutting myself.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I would do so pretty badly, but I would keep it hidden because I didn't want anyone to know. And one day I was sleeping, and at this time I wouldn't go in my room. So I slept on the couch every night in the living room, and my sister and her partner lived in the basement that they had kind of converted. And I was sleeping on the couch and I was screaming, having some nightmare. And I was like still asleep, but I was screaming. And my sister came upstairs and like was trying to soothe me and woke me up. And I was crying, and she was like asking me if I was okay. And I just kept telling her that I wanted to be with my parents again and that I was tired and it was just so difficult. And she called an ambulance on me, and they had me sign a 201. So I voluntarily signed myself into an inpatient facility. And at that time, they were shocked that my sister hadn't enrolled me in therapy yet. I was there for a month. And during that month, I realized that I didn't want to go back to living in the house that my mom had died in. And I kept asking the doctor if I could stay. And he was saying that like I'd already been there a month and most days are about 7 days. And like I had to go home and back to my life eventually. And he discharged me the next day. And I got back home and had what at this time was my second suicide attempt. I had one before my parents died. And I took all of the pills that the doctors had prescribed me and sent me home with. I took all of them and I laid down when I got home from school. And my sister came home from work a few hours later. She was constantly running off fear and anxiety at that point and was like usually doing things to check on my mental well-being. And I guess one of the first things she did when she got home was check my pill bottles, and she saw that they were empty. And so she called another ambulance. And I had my stomach pumped, and I went to another inpatient facility for a month. And then I did outpatient for about 2 months.
You said this was your second attempt?
Yeah,
You did when your parents were alive, you also did?
I did.
Yeah.
Um, and that one was just because of how abusive they were and how difficult my living situation was. And at that time, I was getting it really bad at home, and I was also getting bullied pretty badly at school. And it felt like it was just a constant state of unhappiness and people just constantly tearing me down and not allowing me to be a person. And I felt like I couldn't take it anymore. And I took a bunch of my mom's Xanax and Ambien from the box that I was in charge of. And when she came home, she like had asked for some and I guess noticed that there were a few gone. And she called me a bitch and told me I was selfish and slapped me across the face and sent me to the bathroom and had me stick my fingers down my throat and make myself throw up for a few hours. And she told my sister and my dad and my aunt, and then my family never talked about it again.
Wow. Just checking in right now. How are you doing?
I'm good.
Okay. Okay. Because I want to go back to the other attempt and pick up where we left off.
Yeah, so I was the two in a row for a total of 2 months. And then I went to an outpatient program for another 2 months.
Mm-hmm.
And then at that point, I started doing regular outpatient therapy once a week. And my sister signed up for a family services therapist, which these two really nice women would come to our house and do like family bonding services with me and my sister and her partner. And then around that time, at the end of my 10th grade year, I started smoking weed and hanging out with a much different group of friends than I had up until that point. And then eventually I started taking acid. And the one day I was at um, these like older guys' house, and I forget how old they were, but I was 16 and I think they were like 23 or 24. And I had hooked up with the one guy, and I found out later that he was a heroin and meth addict, and pretty much everyone at that house was. And at that point, I had asked if I could try some, and they were like, no. And I was like, well, you guys get to try it, and I want to know why. Um, and then they let me. It was fueled off of being lost and having bad influences in my life and being depressed. It felt very euphoric. But I think I knew that it was wrong and that it was bad for me, and that was why I didn't seek it out again after that, and I stayed away from it as well as I could. And I think it led me into like more of a spiral, and seeing like where my life was headed and the friends that I was losing. And I had another suicide attempt a few weeks after that, and I took quite a lot of pills at that point.
Were you still living with your sister and her partner?
Yeah, I was. She was still my legal guardian. And so I ended up having another attempt, and I tried to kill myself with my best friend. We both took about 150 pills, mostly sleeping pills.
I gather she was as depressed as you were, and
Yes. Yeah, she was also in a really bad spot.
yeah, yeah.
Um, and we did that together, and then she changed her mind. So we called up my ex-boyfriend, and he picked us up and drove us to the ER. And again, I was in the ICU for about a week, and then I was at another inpatient facility for about a month. And then after that, things started getting really, really bad with my sister. Well, actually, so before any of that happened, and before I was with the guys where I had tried dope, I had another inpatient hospitalization for a month. So I've had quite a few. I kind of lose track of the timeline sometimes. Yeah, so after that last one, my sister found out that I had tried heroin, that I had tried to kill myself with my best friend, and she was very protective and wasn't letting me leave the house. And it got pretty bad at home to the point where she ended up kicking me out of her house. And I stayed in some homeless shelters. And I would say that the first two places I was at were really, really horrible places. Unfortunately, it depends on funding and location. There's not a lot of shelters where the people working there really care. And the same is true for inpatient facilities. Like when you're in an inpatient facility, it depends on how much funding they get and what the area is. Like, of course, you have psychiatrists and therapists and caseworkers, but you don't meet with them very often. So a lot of the staff who's with you the whole time um, isn't paid too well, and they're usually college students. And a lot of them aren't really even necessarily interested in that field. Maybe they're studying to just be something in the medical field, and they're usually there just because it looks good on a resume, I feel like. A lot of them were very insensitive and impatient with us, especially considering the fact that we were minors going through these like very difficult mental health struggles. So I had some experiences in the homeless shelters and the inpatient facilities that were rather difficult.
How old were you at this time?
At this time, I was 17.
Okay.
Um, and so I was at a homeless shelter over the summer for a little over 3 months. And this shelter was very low funded, poor staffing. We weren't allowed outside most days because they didn't have enough staff to watch out after everyone. And quite a few girls had broken out and tried to run away, which resulted in like search parties hunting them down and having to get the police involved and stuff. So most of the time, like all summer long, we were locked inside of these cabins, which were infested with bed bugs, and there were birds living in the roof, and it was a really tough living situation. I got jumped a few times. I got into a couple fights, which was nothing I had ever experienced before this. I had the suicide letter that my dad had written me in my room at the shelter, and a bunch of the girls who had jumped me had taken it from me and destroyed it, and I'll never see that again. So eventually I left the shelter and they sent me to one which was actually a really, really incredible program. But at this time in my life, I didn't talk to anyone in my family. And I had lost all of my friends from childhood who were good influences on me. And I was very alone. The only people I still had in my life were the people who I would say were pretty bad influences and were pretty lost themselves. So when I got to this next facility when I was 17, I started like actively seeking out hard drugs and started using heroin regularly. And I was using it for about 4 months. And one day I was shooting up and I did it incorrectly and I missed my vein and I had an infection growing in my arm and I ignored it for a week and it was so painful I couldn't move my arm and my body was weak and I was becoming very sick. I worked a full shift and then I walked 2 hours to the nearest ER and they immediately took me back and scheduled me the next day for emergency surgery. I was told that if I had waited another day or two, I would have died because the rate that the infection was spreading throughout my body. And so I was in there for about a week. And at that time, I detoxed and I got clean and I went back to the shelter and they had wanted to send me to rehab and I had refused. I couldn't really tell you why at this point I did. I think probably a pride thing and a fear thing mixed together. I felt like I had gotten sober on my own and I didn't want to go to a facility, which looking back is not true. I mean, like I did, but the reason why was because I almost died and I had surgery and I was in the hospital and forced to detox.
What was the surgery for?
It was for the infection. So they had to cut open the crook of my arm and they had to remove like the infected tissue and a large amount of the tissue. and then they had to leave it open for a few days to allow all of the fluids to drain out.
Has that affected your arm since? Is it other than scar edge or something?
No, it's a small scar. I got a little tattoo over it. Um, it was a very painful experience. The combination of the pain from the surgery, and then the pain from detoxing, and then not being able to feel any of the medication that they gave me for the surgery. I just remember being in agonizing pain for a week.
Hmm.
But like coupled with that and finally getting sober was like realizing what I had done to myself and the choices that I had made and how it was destroying my life. And like recognizing that I wanted something different, but I didn't know how to go about it. And I felt like I was pretty much making the same choices of my parents of killing myself, but I was doing it so slowly because I was afraid to actually follow through with it. And I would say my life kind of followed like with that mindset for a few years. But I had really bad trauma and really bad behavioral issues. I was just in a very, very bad mindset, and I treated myself and those around me with a lot of disrespect. And that continued for quite some time. So this was the end of 2016 when that happened. And
Hmm.
so throughout 2017, I would say I really did nothing for myself. Um, and like researching it now, like the past few years, and like really understanding how the brain fixes itself after detoxing from drugs. It takes like about a year for your mental health to get better and to fully recover from that use.
Hmm.
And then like with the trauma on top of that, so like because I was using, I was shoving down the trauma of my parents' suicide and not allowing myself to process or deal with it. And because I didn't take therapy seriously, I also wasn't like receiving help or processing it properly. So even though at this time it had been 3 years since they died, it felt like a lot less. So in 2017, I really didn't do much for myself, but I did stay sober. And after that time, um, I think I started realizing that like I needed help and I didn't know how to go about it. And I signed myself into an inpatient facility again, and I was there for a few weeks. And then I ended up being 302'd later that summer in like May or June.
What is that?
302 is a force inpatient. So when you sign yourself in and it's voluntary, it's a 201. And when it's a 302, it's against your will. And a 302 turns up on your permanent record and a 201 does not, from my understanding. So a 302 means that I was harming myself and I told someone I was doing it and they called the police on me. And the police broke into my apartment and brought me somewhere. And so, like, up until that point, I think I tried enrolling in a few different therapies and I wouldn't show up very consistently. I would go every once in a while, or not be totally honest about how I was feeling or what I needed. Um, and so it was around this time in like 2018 that I was facing like a lot more difficult things in my life and like realizing that I needed therapy and I was really unhappy and that I needed to find some sort of peace. And I enrolled myself in an outpatient program, and I did a therapy that was for like 6 or 7 hours a day, 5 days a week. And I did that for like 2 months, and then I transferred over to a program that was every day for 2 hours. And then I transferred back to the more intensive one, and I did that for a few more weeks, and then I transferred back to the 2 hour one, and then I enrolled in a DBT program.
Wait, can you give a sort of broad overview of what kind of therapy? Like, if you're in therapy for 6 hours a day, like multiple days a week, like what's going on?
So when you're inpatient, the main goal of an inpatient program is safety checks and med checks. So they make sure that you're not actively harming yourself. They help calm suicidal thoughts, and they help fix your medication regimen. And then once those things are done and you're no longer a danger to yourself, you get discharged. And usually when you're discharged, you can go to PHP, partial hospitalization programs, which is the version of that involves more therapy and you go home at night. And I went right to PHP without having an inpatient that time. And you have like a check-in in the morning, and then I think you have about like 3 45-minute groups with about like a 10 or so minute break in between, and then you have a lunch break, and then you have like another like 2 or 3 groups, and then like a little check-in again at the end of the day, and then everyone leaves. There would be ones that were on drug use. There would be ones that were DBT or CBT skills. It would be mindfulness ones. We would have art therapy. We would have like trauma processing, all different kinds of groups where they just try to teach people like general skill sets and ways to like really help themselves.
You mentioned CBT, which is what, cognitive behavioral therapy? Is that
Yes.
right? And then what's the other one? DBT?
DBT stands for dialectical behavioral therapy, and it was created in the 70s by a woman named Marsha Linehan. And it was originally created for people with borderline personality disorder because people with that diagnosis in specific have a really hard time regulating their emotions and understanding what emotional reactions are appropriate. I had first learned about DBT at an inpatient visit in 2015. So when I was still living with my sister and I was an inpatient, and they gave us these handouts, and the handout said cognitive distortions at the top. And it describes, I believe there are seven or nine different cognitive distortions. There are things like minimizing, maximizing, all or nothing, or like black and white thinking. So trauma or PTSD affects your neural pathways. And so somebody who has intensive trauma and is diagnosed with PTSD, when they have an MRI or CAT scan, their brain will show up different than somebody who does not. And a lot of times what happens is when these neural pathways are damaged because of trauma, your thought patterns are damaged. And the way that we think controls the way that we feel. So, for example, if you're looking at an event, like let's say this podcast, and I'm thinking, I'm going to talk about things that are going to make me feel really shitty, then my feeling towards the podcast is going to be anxiety or fear. Maybe I'm not going to want to do it. Maybe I'll back out. It's going to be a very negative sort of thought. But if my thought is, I'm going to talk about things that may be challenging, but talking about them will help me process, and maybe sharing what therapy's helped me can help somebody else. Now my feelings, I still have maybe some of that anxiety or fear, but my feelings are more positive. And so when you learn about cognitive distortions, you learn about how the way that you think impacts the way that you feel. And when you have trauma and your neural pathways are damaged, the way that you think is greatly changed. And especially someone with trauma, especially when you have it as a child and you don't learn these core skills of emotion regulation and mindfulness, you don't know how to work through challenging those thought patterns. And so your feelings are controlling you because your feelings are so strong and intense because you don't know how to control your thoughts. If that made sense.
That makes perfect sense. Yeah. Thanks for the explanation. Yeah.
Yeah. So with cognitive distortions, it teaches you all of these different ways that you can think, and then it teaches you how to untangle them. So in 2015, as a kid, I think I was 16 at this time, and I'm thinking my parents' suicide is my fault because I wasn't a good enough child, or I didn't help them enough, or I let them down, or I did something that made their lives harder to where they felt like they couldn't keep going. And so when I looked at the sheet of cognitive distortions and I realized that I was personalizing a situation or maximizing my own behaviors and how they impacted someone else, I could see that like they're adults who are supposed to take care of me and not the other way around. And when someone commits suicide, it's the fault of the mental ailment, and it's not the fault of anyone else in their lives. So So learning that helped me so, so much, even though at that time I still continued down a path of self-destruction. That one thing always stayed in my mind and I always tried to think about it. And so when I was at the point in 2018 where I finally wanted to go to therapy and really take it seriously, I was researching cognitive distortions and learning about DBT and where this idea had come from that had made such a difference to me. And I read a book about DBT, and I watched some documentaries and a bunch of videos on YouTube, and I decided it was something I really wanted to try out. Um, I had tried talk therapy before, and I think a big reason why I never took it seriously when I was younger is because it's fucking hard and it sucks,
Mhm.
especially when you're looking at um, intense traumas, which a lot of people who are in therapy are suffering from intense trauma. It's not just always like trying to work through daily things in your life. Most people are trying to work through something in specific. And so I found for me that like growing up in this household where my parents were abusive and didn't um, confront their own traumas and didn't have any emotion regulation themselves, I was never taught that. And so I was very emotional, whether it was sadness, anger, anxiety. I would just react. And it was really destructive for me and other people. So when I would try to go to therapy and I would try to talk about how I was feeling, whether it was like what was going on in my relationship or my job that day, or talking about my childhood or things with my parents, I would become so reactive that I wasn't getting anything beneficial out of it. And I would go home from my therapy sessions and just like destroy myself and bring myself down. And I didn't see how this was helpful to anyone. So when I learned about DBT, what was so fucking cool to me is that you get this like massive workbook, and the workbook is filled with like information, and then it's filled with worksheets that you fill out. And so when you go to DBT group, it's structured to where you have a group once a week for 2 hours, and you have an individual session once a week for 1 hour. Each group starts out with a mindfulness practice, and then you go over your homework, and then you learn a skill set for that day. And you go through like certain pages in the workbook, like you're in a college setting looking through a textbook, and you learn these skills to help yourself. And then you get a homework assignment and you go over that and continues on into the next week. And then you have a diary chart that you do each week with your individual therapist. You keep track every day of all of your moods, joy, anger, fear, shame. You keep track of everything on a scale of 1 to 5. And then you keep track of your problem behaviors. So if you're someone who self harms or who uses drugs or who uses gambling or sex or whatever it is to make yourself feel better, you keep track each day of what those behaviors were like for you. And when you meet with your therapist, you go over all of your numbers and you pick what was the highest. So like let's say one day my sadness was really high, and so we're like some of my negative thoughts that I journaled about, and maybe I was like partaking in some self-harm behaviors. So we go through all of that and we do what's called a chain analysis. And the chain analysis breaks down what the actual event was and how we thought about it and how we reacted to it, but then it goes backwards and you see what your vulnerability factors were specifically like to that day. So was I sleep deprived? Was I not eating properly? But also it can look back into past traumas. So like, was I particularly vulnerable in this situation because of something in the past that I haven't dealt with and is now a trigger for me and is now something that I don't know how to deal with? So I was in it for 11 months before I graduated. So over time of the 11 months, you have all of these diary journals and all of these chain analysis breaking down your patterns and seeing how you react to emotional triggers, and then seeing as you're learning the DBT skills, which ones you tend to use most often and which ones are most helpful for you, and like at what states are you able to be aware of an emotion becoming overwhelming and use your mindfulness skills to calm your body down um, physically, because when we get upset our heart rate and our blood pressure rises, and then that's when our thoughts become racing and jumbled. So we learn how to actually calm down our nervous system, and in calming down our nervous system we slow down our thoughts. And so actually being able to see the chain analysis, like one, understanding how your mind is working in that moment, and also over time seeing the change of all of these chain analysis and how like these skills are actually changing your life was just incredible to me.
When did that stop? Or are you still doing that?
So today actually was my first day of my new therapy. So I stopped last week. Yeah, I'm doing a new therapy. It's called EMDR.
Oh
And
yeah.
I am super, super blessed that my DBT therapist got trained in EMDR. So I get to stay with my therapist and I get to incorporate DBT skills into my EMDR therapy.
Very good. So you're doing this in California?
It's all on Zoom right now.
Oh yeah, the old Zoom. I forgot about like what we're on. Okay. How could I forget? Got it. How long have you been in California?
I've only been there since October, but it's been really wonderful. One of the really cool parts, specifically like with my healing and my journey through this, is that I had a history when I was younger of being very codependent and being very depressed and not fulfilled with myself or the relationships that I was in, but staying in them because they were familiar. And now I feel like I'm at a point where I've like taken the initiative for a while to get my own help and to be in therapy programs because I've decided I need them. So it's made a really big difference because I'm like actively making changes to help myself. And in doing that, me and my partner really motivate each other. So like he'll look at the textbook with me and he'll look at the homework assignment that I have done and he'll see like how he can apply that to himself. And then when I feel like I need help with something, he's like familiar with the DBT skills and we'll be like, okay, what DBT skill do we use right now? And we do that for each other. So it's really cool that like this like huge part of my life is something that he's also like really embraced and taken on for himself.
That's great. Yeah. Are you doing any work when you're out there?
And OnlyFans.
Ah, right on.
Yeah. Um, so I mean, I've already been doing that since 2019. I was on Snapchat before I was on OnlyFans. Now I have both, and I make enough money to buy food and support whatever adventures we go on.
Is the therapy affordable?
Because my parents passed away when I was a minor, and you're allowed to be on your parents' health insurance until you're 26, I get government health insurance.
Oh wow, that's good.
Yeah, you can be on your parents' health insurance, I think in the entire country until you're 26. And then like once you're 26, your parents can't claim you anymore, and that's when you start paying for your own. So anybody who was in the system, or was orphaned as a minor is considered like in the care of the state and the government until that time. So once I'm 26, I will have to get my own health insurance and pay for therapy myself. But as of right now, that is one of the few things that's been offered to me, which is definitely the most beneficial because it's given me a way to heal.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, Speaking of beneficial, this is a question I ask all of my guests. What are the benefits, if any, of what you've gone through?
There are a lot. I would say one, finding resilience and strength within myself and and being able to say when I need help. And and I wouldn't for years. And it finally got to the point where I was a bad person. I hurt myself and I hurt other people, and I knew that I was a bad person. And and for a really long time, I kind of like ran off of self pity and off of just feeling sorry for myself and feeling like I didn't deserve any better and I deserved to feel pain. And it was like okay that I was living that way. And then just like one day it changed and I just realized that that wasn't true. And I was like so much more than the pain that I was experiencing. And so like really developing like self-worth and self-love and self-respect. in accepting the fact that I deserved better, I had to learn how to forgive myself for who I used to be. And in doing that, I had to have empathy, because I would say forgiving yourself is the hardest person to forgive, because you need to hold yourself accountable and you need to admit what you've done wrong so that you can change and move forward. But you can't actually do that unless you forgive yourself, and you can't forgive yourself unless you have empathy toward yourself. And in being able to offer myself those things, I learned how to forgive other people who hurt me or let me down. And it taught me a lot of empathy towards other people. Yeah, I would definitely say like forgiveness and empathy, and being able to take responsibility for my own actions, and being able to be appreciative uh, for what life does offer me. There was a really long time after my parents died where I was very resentful and very envious. And I stopped hanging out with certain friends in high school because I felt like they didn't understand me, or they were close to their parents and it was hard to go to their house and see that. And so that feeling of envy like led to a lot of resentment and hatred and isolation. And instead of giving into that feeling now, I feel gratitude that other people have things that are worth wanting. And that really balances me. I think like watching my parents be depressed growing up and eventually having that turn into both of them taking their lives kind of taught me when I was a kid that like that sadness is validated. And that sadness is validated, but it is not okay to allow it to control you. And it is not okay to ever give up. And so, in watching them give up, they taught me that I don't ever want to do that. And they gave me an appreciation for life that I would have never had, that I didn't have growing up. And it really just like showed me how beauty is so much more powerful than pain, but that you have to allow yourself to experience it. And it can take a lot of effort and hard work.
All right. I'd like to thank Frankie for sharing her story and some of the tools that she's used to work with things, including DBT, which I'll have a couple links about that in our show notes on the website, friendswithdeficitspodcast.com, where you can also sign up for our newsletter. And you can find this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please listen, subscribe, tell your friends, YouTube, Spotify, everywhere. If you'd like to actually help support the show and be part of the community that gets access to a lot of insider stuff and things related to your host, me, the show, and so on, check out patreon.com/friendswithdeficits, patreon.com/friendswithdeficits for more information. Once again, I'm Adam Sultan. Don't give up.